Hello, my dear friends. If your wedding night was watched by relatives, your bloody sheets were kept as evidence, and a rumour about your sexual activity was enough to embarrass your entire clan, then you were living in the world of the Vikings. For them, sex was not a private matter, but something public, monitored, and used to measure human worth. Honour, power, and even survival were all tied to what happened in bed. Tonight, join me in delving into some of the most shocking sexual practices that the Vikings considered normal. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If you think modern funerals are uncomfortable, you might want to skip what happened in 922 AD. That year, a Muslim diplomat named Ahmad ibn Fadlan was sent to Eastern Europe on behalf of the Abbasid Caliphate. His job was to deliver a letter and maintain relations. He didn't go looking for culture shock, but when he arrived in the land near the Volga River, he met a group of Norsemen. We now call them Vikings. One of their chieftains had died. Ibn Fadlan was invited to witness the funeral. What he saw was not something he could forget. The Vikings didn't bury people with silence and flowers. They prepared a wooden ship to serve as the dead man's final resting place. They placed his body on it. They added weapons, armour, animals, and food. But that wasn't all. They needed someone to accompany him, a living person, a slave girl. She didn't step forward immediately. The tribe asked who would go with the chief. After some time, one girl agreed. From that moment on, her life was no longer hers. Over the next several days, the girl was treated as part of the funeral process. She was given alcohol and herbal drugs. Then she was taken to various tents. In each one, a man had sex with her. This was not hidden. The tribe believed this ritual transferred energy. Each man whispered that it was for the dead chief. That was what they were doing would help him in the next world. The girl cried, but no one stopped. Everyone believed this was the right thing to do. It's disturbing how everyone around her acted like this was completely normal, like passing around a cup at a feast. She was cleaned and dressed in fine clothing. Her eyes were painted. Her hair was braided. She was led to the funeral ship where her master's body had been laid out. On that final day, 6 more men had sex with her while people watched. It was quiet. No one laughed. No one seemed bothered. After the final man stepped away, an older woman entered the ship. She was called the Angel of Death. Her role was clear. She took a thick cord and wrapped it around the girl's neck. At the same time, another person stabbed her in the ribs. The girl struggled for a few seconds. Then she stopped. They placed her body next to the chief. Arms folded, eyes closed. The ship was set on fire. The flames rose, and the tribe began chanting. Ibn Fadlan stood and watched. He did not interfere. He did not argue. He simply observed and later wrote down what he saw. Every detail, no added emotion, no exaggerated language, just what happened. For years, historians thought he must have invented the entire event, but then archaeologists began finding graves that looked just like the one he described. In Norway, the Osberg ship was discovered. Inside were the remains of 2 women. One of them showed signs of violent death. Other ship graves across Scandinavia had similar details: a man of high status, a younger woman, signs of ritual killing. Tools, animal bones, ceremonial items, the pattern repeated. The story Ibn Fadlan told was real. It was not a myth, it was Viking practice. Compared to this, today's cremations with soft music and polished urns feel like quiet business meetings. The Vikings made funerals into events, public ones. The dead did not go alone. They took objects, animals, and sometimes people. Not everyone was given this kind of funeral. It was mostly for leaders, for men of power. The more important the person, the more elaborate the death. The slave girl wasn't seen as a person anymore. She became a part of the ritual. The tribe didn't mourn her. They didn't cry over her. They believed she had a purpose, to help the dead man arrive in the next world with strength and honour, to carry part of the living world with him. Her death was seen as necessary. It was not about cruelty. It was about tradition. This belief was so strong that no one seemed to question it, not even her. Once she agreed to die, the rest was automatic. She followed instructions. She drank what they gave her. She allowed what they demanded. She walked onto the ship without resistance. Her part was clear. There was no ceremony for her, no goodbye, just steps to follow, and then it was over. Ibn Fadlan's account became one of the most detailed outside descriptions of Viking life. Not from a saga, not from legend, but from someone who was there. He saw it. He wrote it. And now, we know it happened. The graves confirmed the violence and the layout and the method of the items. All of it matched. The more we dig up, the more we see that he wasn't lying. This type of funeral wasn't used for every Viking, but it happened often enough to leave a record. The fact that it was so structured tells us how accepted it was. People played their roles. The men, the angel of death, the girl, even the animals. Everyone had a place. Nothing was chaotic. It was all planned, step by step. I still can't decide what's more shocking, the act itself or how coldly it was carried out. There were no outbursts, no protests. The tribe saw it as their duty. The fire burned, the ship drifted, and when it was done, everyone went home. They had honoured their leader, they had followed the old ways, that was enough. The story makes it clear that in Viking culture, power didn't end with death, it followed into the afterlife. The funeral was proof of that, and the girl, though silent, became part of that power. Her death was not recorded in her name, only as part of someone else's journey. It's strangely absurd that they treated it like a sacred act while turning it into a public execution. Next, we'll see how the Vikings used the same logic not just for the dead, but for the living, where sex wasn't just part of a farewell, it became a weapon. That ritual wasn't the exception. It was a glimpse into how Vikings thought about power, and sex, for them, wasn't just a private matter, it was woven into everything. They used it to control, to punish, to reward, and to reinforce their place in the world, whether through public rituals, battlefield humiliation, or legal consequences. Intimacy wasn't really intimate. It was about dominance. It was about structure. It was about staying in control. There were specific words in the Viking world that could destroy a man's life. One of the worst was rega. That word didn't just mean weak. It meant being passive during sex. And being passive meant losing respect. If someone called you that in public, you had the legal right to kill them. No questions asked. You could stab a man in the street and walk away because nothing damaged a Viking man more than being labelled sexually submissive. Another word was og, which carried a similar meaning. These weren't insults that could be laughed off. They were serious accusations. If they stuck, your entire life could fall apart. You might lose your right to carry weapons. You might not be allowed to speak in court. In some places, you could lose your land. It didn't matter how many battles you had fought. If people believed you were sexually weak, your place in society vanished. It's strange how the legal system focuses more on rumours about bedroom roles than whether someone stole a goat or burned down a hut. That shows how deep the fear of weakness ran. People didn't just want to win in war, they wanted to dominate in every setting, including the most personal one. And if you failed to meet those expectations, people didn't forget. These ideas weren't hidden. They were written into laws. The Icelandic law code spelled out the consequences. If you were accused of being unmanly and didn't respond, the accusation became fact. You were expected to fight, sometimes to the death. Honour had to be restored. Silence wasn't an option. A Viking man had to be hard in speech, hard in war, and hard in bed. This pressure was everywhere. Sagas are filled with feuds that began because someone questioned another man's masculinity. Not his fighting skill, not his leadership, but his role in private acts. Some of these feuds lasted for years. Dozens of people died just because one man called another too soft. Wives used it too. A woman could ruin her husband with a single comment in front of the right people. Compared to how people argue today over who forgot to text back, Viking masculinity was a full-time job with no days off. It never ended. Even a husband and wife weren't equals in this system. If a man showed too much tenderness, his wife could mock him. If he didn't perform well enough, she could leave him. She might even take his property with her. Viking women had that right if they were freeborn. This structure created constant tension. Men had to prove their dominance all the time, in fights, in drinking halls, in marriage beds. And if someone lost that dominance, even once, others noticed. Stories travelled fast, reputation crumbled, and once it did, it was almost impossible to rebuild. Because in this world, being marked as passive meant being treated as less than a man. That's why sexual violence became a method of psychological warfare. When Vikings captured enemies, especially leaders, they didn't always kill them. Sometimes they humiliated them instead. One method was called the shame stroke. It involved stabbing or cutting a man's buttocks after defeat. The act symbolized penetration, turning the victim into a figure of mockery. There are sagas where entire groups chased a man across the sea because he had once insulted them in that way. Killing him wasn't enough. He had to be broken. Viking society didn't just fear weakness. It punished it. The idea was simple. If you take away someone's ability to dominate, you take away their identity, and that extended into every part of life. I still think the scariest part isn't how violent it was, but how logical it all seemed to them. There was a system, a hierarchy, a list of rules. They believed in it so fully that people followed it without hesitation, even when it led to death. Even when it broke families, even when it made life unbearable. This structure also applied to slaves. Free women had some protections, though limited, but slave women had none. Viking law stated clearly that using a slave for sex wasn't a crime. It might be a property offence at best. If a slave resisted, she could be beaten, if she were killed in the process. The punishment was usually a small fine. Her body was worth no more than a broken tool, and so, sex was not an expression of love or comfort. It was a chart of control. Men used it to climb higher. Women used it to defend their status or destroy their rivals. Enemies used it to cause lasting damage. Everyone knew their place, and that place was constantly under threat. You could lose it in one night, in one word, in one failed act. These weren't accidents. They were choices. The Viking world wasn't chaotic. It had rules, harsh, cold, clear rules, and sex wasn't outside those rules. It was built into them. It was part of the system. It's almost ridiculous that people treated power like a bedroom contract with blood clauses. Next, we'll look at what happened when Vikings used sex not just as punishment or insult, but as part of public law and ritual, where even weddings were staged events with witnesses, sheets, and consequences. The same rules that turned sex into a weapon also shaped how Vikings thought about marriage. It wasn't a private moment between two people. It was a public matter with legal consequences, family involvement, and community oversight. The wedding itself was only the beginning. What really mattered came after. The first night, the first act, the proof that the marriage was complete. For a Viking wedding to be valid, the couple had to have sex. That wasn't assumed. It had to be seen, heard, or confirmed. In many cases, both families provided witnesses, not to sit in the room but to stand nearby and listen. Sometimes a trusted family member would remain in the room to watch. If no one could verify that the marriage had been consummated, it could be declared invalid. That meant the dowry could be returned. That meant land and property agreements could be cancelled. The couple had responsibilities. The bride was expected to show proof of virginity. This often meant blood on the bedsheets. The groom was expected to perform without failure. If he couldn't, the bride's family could accuse him of dishonouring the agreement. There were laws written with penalties for both sides. If the bride was not a virgin and had hidden it, her family could be sued. If the groom failed to consummate the marriage, he might have to pay compensation. It's almost hilarious that a wedding night could turn into a courtroom, with sheets as evidence and relatives as witnesses. Nothing about it was romantic. The act itself was treated like a legal transaction, and that wasn't by accident. Marriage in Viking society was about land, bloodlines, and alliances. Emotions came last. Agreements came first. Symbols played a major role. During the ceremony, a priest would place Thor's hammer on the bride's lap. It wasn't just for show. Everyone knew it represented fertility. The hammer stood for male power. The lap represented the womb. The ritual was simple and clear. After that, the bride would wear a crown made of metal or flowers. It wasn't just decoration. Removing the crown later, usually by the groom, symbolised that she was no longer a maiden. The couple was then led to the bed by both families. The bed itself was often decorated with herbs and oils thought to bring luck and children. A priest or elder would say a blessing. It usually mentions fertility directly. Some even included graphic references, spoken out loud with serious faces. This wasn't done in secret. It was part of the script. It was expected. Compared to today's wedding speeches and awkward dancing, this looks like a fertility ritual mixed with a notary appointment. Everyone played a part. No one acted embarrassed. The process was old and known. The focus was not on how the couple felt, but on whether they followed the correct steps. Marriage was a contract. The sexual act was its seal. The morning after came with its own duties. The bedsheets were examined. If they showed blood, they might be kept as proof. In some families, they were stored in case a legal dispute happened later. If there was no blood, people asked questions. If there was a problem, a formal complaint could be filed. This could lead to a second ceremony or even a complete annulment. That kind of pressure wasn't unique. In many Viking sagas, men brag about their ability to satisfy their wives. Women talk about what they expect in return. A man who failed to do his part could lose face. A woman who refused could face suspicion. Both had roles, and those roles were clear. I find it troubling that what should have been a personal moment became something the whole village had an opinion on. But that was how the Vikings lived. Privacy didn't have much room in their culture. What you did in bed could follow you to court. It could affect your inheritance. It could decide your social standing. Expectation extended beyond the couple. The community needed to see that the marriage was real. It wasn't about love. It was about continuity. A family alliance meant little if there were no children, and children only came if the marriage started the right way. That belief turned the wedding night into a kind of test, one that had to be passed immediately and without excuses. This was especially true for high-status families. Kings, jarls, and wealthy landowners all faced more scrutiny. Their marriages involved property, politics, and public image. If something went wrong on the first night, it could lead to conflict between clans. That made the rituals even more detailed, even more watched. The pressure didn't only fall on the men. Brides were expected to be pure. Their bodies were treated like part of the dowry. Virginity wasn't just a virtue. It was proof of value. If that proof wasn't delivered, the bride's worth could be questioned, and that worth wasn't just personal. It reflected on her entire family. Sometimes, the rituals took strange turns. In one saga, the bride's uncle stayed in the room to make sure the groom did his job. That wasn't seen as strange. It was seen as practical. In other stories, midwives were involved in the morning after, collecting and inspecting the sheets. The details may vary, but the goal was always the same: proof. Viking marriage was a transaction. That doesn't mean there was no affection, but affection didn't protect you from the rules. The ritual had to be performed, the proof had to be given, the families had to be satisfied. Only then did the marriage count. Only then could the couple move on. It's honestly bizarre how something so personal became an event with paperwork, witnesses, and physical evidence. Next, we'll explore how the same logic applies to sex as punishment. Losing in battle didn't just mean wounds, but permanent shame. Once the wedding was complete and the proof was accepted, the couple's place in society was more secure. But that didn't mean personal reputation was safe. In Viking society, respect didn't come from age or money alone. It came from how others saw you. And a few things mattered more than your sexual role. Not who you loved, not how often, but how was your role understood by others. The Vikings had no patience for men who didn't meet the expectations of dominance. They had words for those who failed. Raga and Vega were the most serious. These terms didn't just mean weak, they meant sexually passive. If someone called you that, it wasn't a joke. It was a direct attack on your honour, and the law made it clear you had the right to kill someone for saying it. This wasn't just about pride, it was built into the legal structure. The accusation alone, if left unanswered, could stain a man's reputation permanently. He would be seen as unfit to lead, to fight, or even to speak in legal matters. He could lose his right to inherit. His voice would be dismissed. His property could be questioned, all because of what someone claimed he did behind closed doors. It's absurd how one word could turn a warrior into a nobody, all because of a rumour about who did what in bed. But that was how the system worked. The sexual role wasn't private, it was social. The man who took control kept his status. The one who didn't was seen as less than a man. That idea wasn't challenged. It was accepted by nearly everyone. The sagas are full of examples. Conflicts that started because one man questioned another's masculinity. Arguments in drinking halls turned deadly after just a few words. Entire families were pulled into feuds that lasted for years. People died. Homes were burned. Alliances broke down. All because someone insulted another man's place in the sexual hierarchy. The fear of being labelled passive made men act with constant aggression. They had to prove their strength in every setting, on the battlefield, in court, at home, even in casual conversation. If someone made a remark, you had to respond. If you stayed quiet, people assumed it was true. Silence was treated as agreement. Compared to modern standards, where people argue over opinions online, Viking insults could legally justify murder. That created a culture where men were always alert, always ready to fight, not just to defend their land, but to defend their name. The threat wasn't just physical, it was social, and that made it even more powerful. The consequences went beyond personal reputation. A man who lost his honour could no longer serve as a witness. He couldn't make contracts. His word carried no weight. Even if he was wealthy or skilled, the label stayed with him. It followed him everywhere. He might still live in the community, but he would be ignored. In many ways, he became invisible, that fear shaped daily life. Boys were raised with warnings. Don't act weak. Don't let anyone call you soft. Don't give others a reason to doubt you. The message was clear. Strength was everything. But strength didn't just mean swinging a sword. It meant controlling how others saw you. Every word, every act, every reaction was measured. Sometimes, the accusations were used as weapons. In a feud, calling someone Raga could be more effective than a spear. It would force the accused to fight back. If he didn't, the shame would grow. If he did, the situation escalated. Either way, the one who made the insult gained power. That made these words dangerous. Not just personally, but politically. I still find it shocking that legal documents had to include guidelines for what to do when someone called you sexually passive. But they did. The laws spelled it out clearly. How to respond. How much time did you had? What were the penalties if you didn't act? It was all written down like a manual for how to protect your masculinity. The burden wasn't just on the accused. The one who made the claim had to be careful. If you called someone Raga and couldn't prove it, you could be punished just as harshly. In some cases, Making a false accusation was treated like slander or even murder. That meant these words carried weight on both sides. They weren't thrown around lightly. This dynamic also influenced how people behaved socially. Men avoided anything that might make them seem soft. That included clothing, gestures, or even certain hobbies. They had to maintain an image, one that matched the expectations of dominance and control. That image became a kind of armour, and anyone who cracked it risked losing everything. The obsession with roles didn't lead to security, it led to anxiety. People lived in fear of being labelled, of being watched, of being judged for things that might not even be true. It didn't matter what actually happened. What mattered was what people believed. That belief became law. The Vikings didn't have privacy in the way we understand it. Personal acts were part of public life. Your behaviour, your speech, your role in sex, all became tools for others to measure you. And if they didn't like what they saw, they had legal means to tear you down. It's almost comical how a culture so focused on toughness ended up making everyone afraid of a few syllables. Next, we'll look at how this fear of submission fed into a wider system of humiliation, where even in defeat, a man could be shamed so deeply that death felt like mercy. Everything in Viking society came down to who had power. But unlike many other cultures, power wasn't just about land, money, or family name. It was about the role. Specifically, your role in bed. There was a line drawn sharply between those who took and those who received. The man who took control, the one who initiated and dominated, was seen as honourable. The one who did not, the one in the so-called passive role, was seen as weak. And weakness wasn't just mocked, it was punished. This division wasn't based on preference or identity. It was legal, it was structural. If a man was known or even rumoured to be passive, he lost more than dignity, he lost rights. In some parts of Scandinavia, a man with that reputation could no longer carry weapons. That meant he was no longer considered a warrior. He couldn't fight for his tribe. He couldn't protect his land. His sword was taken, both literally and symbolically. He also lost his voice in court. His testimony no longer counted. It didn't matter how honest he was or how much he had seen. A man labelled passive was treated like a liar. He could no longer make contracts. He could not act as a witness. In the eyes of the law, he was damaged beyond repair, and that loss of credibility affected every part of his life. It's almost impressive how quickly a single rumour could reduce a man from citizen to ghost, because once the label stuck, recovery was nearly impossible. Viking society was not built to offer second chances. A man might rebuild his home, he might earn back wealth, but he could never erase what others believed about his status. Inheritance was another wall he would hit. A passive man might be denied his share of land or family goods even if he was the eldest son, even if his name was on the property. Other relatives could challenge the inheritance, and the courts, seeing his damaged reputation, often sided against him. That meant losing not just honour but survival. Land meant food. Land meant place. Without it, a man drifted on the edge of society. That structure didn't happen by accident. It was reinforced through law, story, and expectation. Boys were raised to believe that anything soft was dangerous, that letting go of control, even once, meant letting go of manhood, and so they trained not just in weapons and skills, but in the performance of masculinity. They watched their fathers, they copied their brothers, they learned early what was acceptable and what was fatal. Compared to today's debates about identity and gender, Viking views were like a courtroom where you only got one sentence. You either met the standard or you did not, and if you failed, no one waited to understand why. The system wasn't designed to ask questions, it was designed to assign status. This kind of thinking created strict categories. Men who held power didn't just dominate in bed, they also dominated in meetings, in decisions, in public events. Their sexual dominance mirrored their social rank. And that was no coincidence. The connection between sex and power was intentional. It kept the hierarchy in place. Even gods weren't safe from this system. In the sagas, gods who crossed lines were mocked. Loki, who shifted forms and sometimes took on female roles, was often laughed at. Odin, who practiced certain types of magic associated with women, was sometimes criticised by other gods. These stories weren't told for entertainment. They were told to remind people what happened when power was questioned. The link between sexual position and public status also showed up in punishments. If a man was defeated in battle and sexually humiliated, his life afterward was marked. He couldn't return home with pride. His body carried the symbol of defeat. His tribe might turn him away. His name might never be spoken again. That wasn't just punishment. It was removal. He didn't die, but he was erased. I think the cruelest part is that no one had to touch you to take everything from you. They just had to believe something happened, and that belief worked like fact. It spread. It stuck. It changed how people treated you. You might walk the same roads. You might eat the same meals, but you were no longer seen the same way. This system didn't allow for flexibility. There were no neutral roles. There was no room for compromise. You were either in control or you were controlled. The idea of equals in bed didn't exist. That would have broken the logic. And Viking society didn't tolerate broken logic. Every structure had to support the same idea. That power flowed in one direction. This rigidity made society predictable, but also brittle. It meant strength had to be constantly proven, and it meant that even powerful men lived with fear. Fear of failure, fear of rumour, fear of a challenge they might not survive. In public, they laughed and boasted, but in private, the system never let them rest. It's quietly absurd how much pressure they built around something that most people today see as private. Next, we'll examine how this hierarchy didn't just live in rules and reputations. It showed up in battlefields and scars, where sexual conquest became a method of breaking enemies without killing them. In Viking society, masculinity was not something you simply had. It was something you performed, constantly, in front of others. A man's worth wasn't judged by what he claimed, but by what others believed about him. And when it came to sexuality, even the smallest hint of weakness could destroy everything. It didn't take an act. It didn't take proof. A single rumour was enough to bring down a warrior, a chieftain, or a household name. The terms vega and rega weren't just casual insults. They were accusations that went to the heart of a man's identity. To be labelled passive in a sexual encounter was to be marked as lesser, as submissive, as something other than a real man. These weren't private concerns. They were public condemnations. And in many cases, they were punishable by death. Not the death of the accused, but the death of the accuser, because Viking law allowed a man to kill anyone who hurled these words at him, and often he would walk away without consequence. It's strange to think that one word about your bedroom could do more damage than a sword to the chest. In a culture that valued strength, bravery, and dominance, losing your reputation as a masculine figure was like losing your sword, your shield, and your ship all at once. Men lived with this fear hanging over them every day. They had to speak loudly, fight fiercely, and flirt boldly, not just for fun, but to prove they were still men. Because if they didn't, someone else might start whispering. It wasn't only about what you did, it was about how people interpreted what you did. If you avoided a fight, you could be called a coward. If you refused a drink, you might be seen as weak. If you showed too much affection to another man, even as a friend, some might say you were soft. There was no safety, no line you could stand behind. Everything was a test. This pressure created a cycle of overcompensation. Men pushed each other harder, drank more than they wanted, fought when they didn't need to, and constantly exaggerated their stories. Bragging became a shield. Boasting wasn't just allowed, it was expected. If you weren't loud about your conquests, people would assume you had none, and then the rumours might begin. Young men had it the worst. They hadn't yet earned battle scars or stories. They were watched closely, measured by every action, weighed by every silence. If they were too quiet, people would talk. If they were too emotional, they might be labelled soft. So many tried to act older, meaner, louder than they really were. They mimicked the chieftains and the berserkers, hoping the noise would protect them. Compared to today, where masculinity is debated in think pieces and podcasts, Viking masculinity was brutally simple and terrifyingly rigid. It's hard to overstate how deeply this system shaped their lives. Masculinity wasn't one aspect of identity, it was the whole thing. A man without it had no place. He could not join raids, speak in assemblies, inherit land, or represent his family. He became invisible. Worse than invisible, he became a shame to those around him. That's why so many sagas include duels that begin with insults. One man calls another Raga, and the next day, one of them is dead. These weren't petty arguments. These were legal and cultural battles over identity, and if you didn't fight, you proved the insult true. So the fight wasn't a choice, it was a duty. There's something especially cruel about how little evidence was needed. You didn't have to be caught in the act. You didn't need a witness. Just a whisper was enough. And even if you defended yourself successfully, the stain might linger. People would remember. They'd tell the story again, with new twists. The gossip would grow teeth. A lie could live longer than the man it hurt. I can't help but feel sorry for the quieter ones, the thinkers, the hesitant boys who never stood a chance. And it wasn't just about shame. Losing your masculine status could bring real legal consequences. You could be barred from trials, denied weapons, shut out from inheritance. Your voice, your money, your rights, all gone. And because these losses weren't officially recorded, they didn't come with warning. One day you were part of the community. The next, you were a ghost. Men who sensed their reputations slipping often tried desperate things. Some started fights in taverns. Others courted women aggressively in public. Some insulted others just to shift the spotlight. The more a man feared being seen as weak, the more violent he might become. And Viking society rewarded that violence. It saw it as proof of strength. There are stories of men who killed their own kin because of rumours. Others burned down homes, forced confessions, even bribed witnesses. All to protect a reputation that could vanish in a single conversation. What made it worse was that there was no way to earn it back once it was lost. You couldn't undo the suspicion. You could only try to silence it. The most tragic cases were the ones where the accused had done nothing wrong. Maybe they were simply quiet, or kind, or uninterested in proving anything. That alone was dangerous. In a world built on dominance, being still could be seen as surrender. And surrender had no place in Viking masculinity. This extreme system of gender control helped Viking leaders maintain order. It gave men something to fear and something to chase. But it also made every day feel like a battlefield. The fight wasn't just in the fjords or the forests. It was in every room, every hall, every feast. It was in how you walked, how you laughed, how you looked at others. Masculinity became a cage with iron bars made of silence and stares, and every man carried the key, but only for others. Never for himself. Next, we'll leave the men behind for a moment and look at what Viking women were expected to be, and how some of them refused to play by the rules. The next time you hear someone say that words can't hurt, remember the Viking age. In that world, a single word could break a man's future, shame his family, and start a feud that would last generations, especially if that word questioned his masculinity. These were not just personal slights, they were triggers for bloodshed, and many of the Icelandic sagas were built around such moments, when one man looked another in the eye and called him weak, passive, or unmanly. The insult didn't need to be shouted, it didn't even need to be repeated. Just once was enough. Once, in the wrong hall, in the wrong tone, in front of the bad people, and the damage was done. The man on the receiving end had only two options. Either he proved the insult false with violence, or he lived with it forever. And in Viking society, living with it meant losing everything. It's no surprise that so many feuds began this way. A quiet gathering, a few cups of ale. And then, from across the table, someone mentioned a rumour. Maybe it was about a failed seduction. Maybe about the man's voice, or his posture, or something more explicit. And suddenly the room grew still. Everyone waited. Would he stand? Would he fight if he did? It proved nothing. If he didn't, it proved everything. It's a bit like modern internet culture, where one comment can ruin your whole week, except back then, it might destroy your entire bloodline. What followed these insults could vary. In some cases, it was a quick fight, a broken table, a cut cheek. But often, it went further. Families got involved, brothers picked sides, weapons were sharpened, and someone died. Then someone else, then another. Before long, it became a feud, a pattern of revenge that spiraled far beyond the original insult. The sagas describe these events with grim clarity. A man is accused of being Raga. He challenges the accuser. They fight. One dies. His kin vow revenge. More fighting. Homes burned. Livestock stolen. Sometimes entire farms are wiped out. And at the heart of it all was that single moment when a man's honour was put on trial and the only judge was violence. This wasn't just about wounded pride. It was about social survival. If a man accepted the insult, others would begin to treat him differently. He might be excluded from raids, passed over in assemblies, or denied marriage alliances. People might laugh behind his back, or worse, pity him. In Viking culture, pity could cut deeper than steel. It's hard not to feel a strange kind of respect for how much power they gave to a single word, and how quickly that word could tear apart a village. Some of the most famous Viking feuds began with nothing more than suspicion. A man walks into a hall, and someone mentions his long hair, his soft hands, or his close friendship with another man. That's all it takes. The accused feels the pressure of every eye. He knows what they're thinking. He also knows that if he doesn't act now, the rumours will grow. So he acts, he fights, and maybe he kills. But even then, the gossip might not stop. There were no courts for these matters, no official hearings, just a code of honour enforced by fists and axes. Even the laws of the time, while strict about property and inheritances, were vague when it came to insults. But they were clear about one thing. If someone insulted your masculinity and you killed him on the spot, it might be forgiven. Not always, but often. Especially if the community understood the weight of what had been said. I sometimes wonder how many men were buried not because of who they were, but because someone else said something they couldn't ignore. In some cases, the accusations were planned. A rival might use the insult to provoke a fight he wanted, or to ruin a man standing without ever lifting a blade. It was a weapon as effective as any spear, and harder to trace. A well-timed insult could shift the balance of power in a village or even a clan. Viking poets and storytellers understood this well. They built entire epics around these moments, not because the insult itself was dramatic, but because of what it represented. A challenge to manhood, a threat to reputation, a spark that could light years of conflict, and the audience knew it too. They didn't laugh at the insult. They held their breath, waiting to see what the insulted man would do, and often he did what he had to, not because he wanted to fight, but because he had no choice. The moment someone questioned his masculinity, the clock started ticking. Every second that passed without a response made the insult stronger. So he fought, or he hunted the accuser down later, or he tried to reclaim his honour in some other way. But it was always too late to walk away clean. The weight of these expectations fell on every man, even the elders, even the warriors, even the kings. No one was above it. Masculinity was not a permanent title. It had to be defended constantly, and one wrong word could take it all away. That's why Viking men guarded their image so fiercely. They spoke carefully, acted boldly, and punished insults swiftly, not just for themselves, but for their families, their clans, their gods. Reputation was not a private thing. It was a shield that covered everyone close to you, and once it cracked, it could not be repaired. Strangely, it makes our modern dramas about social media look like very polite tea parties. There's something deeply unsettling about how fragile their system was, how easily violence could erupt. There was little room for forgiveness or misunderstanding, but it was the world they lived in, a world where your worth could be measured by a single word, and your future decided by your response to it. Next, we'll turn from men to women and examine what happened when Viking women rejected their expected roles and challenged the system from within. If Viking men lived under constant pressure to prove their masculinity, Viking women were far from passive in that dynamic. They were not silent victims or delicate ornaments waiting to be claimed. They understood the power they held, and sometimes they wielded it with surgical precision. In a world that valued sexual dominance and strength, a woman could destroy a man's honour without raising a sword. All she had to do was speak. There were cases recorded in saga after saga of women publicly accusing their husbands of weakness in bed. The accusation alone could crack a man's standing in the community. If she said he was soft, hesitant, or worse, passive, others listened, and when others heard, they judged. The same code that demanded men respond violently to insults gave women the leverage to humiliate or even end a man's influence. It wasn't just gossip. It was a blow to his right to exist as a man among men. Sometimes it was personal. A wife frustrated with a marriage could turn that frustration into a campaign. She might start small, a joke at a feast, a remark to a friend. But once she said the words, she knew exactly where they would go. And if the husband failed to respond with strength, the narrative took on a life of its own. His peers would talk, his rivals would whisper, and his value, as both a man and a leader, would drop. It's a bit like when someone posts a sarcastic breakup rant online today, and your reputation dies in the comments. Viking women weren't doing this solely out of spite. They had rights, more than most women in medieval Europe. A wife had the legal ability to initiate divorce, and sexual performance was a valid reason. If she claimed that her husband had failed to satisfy her or was too timid in the bedroom, the court would listen. No need for evidence beyond her word. Her voice carried weight, not because the system favoured women, but because sex was so tightly linked to honour. That legal weight gave women real power. A dissatisfied wife could not only end a marriage but also leave a mark on her ex-husband's reputation that might never fade. In some cases, the man found it difficult to remarry. Others were mocked or challenged by younger men who now saw them as weak. The fallout could last years. Sometimes it led to revenge. Other times, the man simply left the village, choosing exile over shame. One famous case tells of a woman who, after leaving her husband, stood in public and detailed his failures with cruel precision. She mimicked his movements. She mocked his words. The crowd laughed, but the husband, unable to counter the claims without exposing even more, remained silent. From that day forward, no one saw him the same way. He was a warrior once, but after that day, he was a joke. I can't decide what's more brutal, Viking axe fights or Viking pillow talk. Not all women use this power destructively. Some invoked it to escape abusive or unwanted marriages. The law provided them with a way out, and they took it. Others may have used it to shift family alliances, gain favour, or protect their children's futures. In any case, the ability to use sexual dissatisfaction as legal ammunition made Viking women uniquely empowered compared to their European counterparts. It also meant that men had to be cautious. They couldn't just rely on strength in battle or loud words in the hall. They had to satisfy expectations at home too. If they failed there, even the strongest war chief could find himself vulnerable. There was no private life, not really. A man's worth was always under review, and his wife was his closest judge. Some may argue that this power created a balance. The man could end a feud with an axe, but the woman could end his social life with a sentence. Neither side had complete control, and both knew that their roles in the household were tied to community judgment. Reputation was a shared burden. It reminds me how in modern relationships, one angry podcast episode can do the work of a dozen lawyers. The ability for women to speak openly about such matters reflected a cultural comfort with sex that often surprises modern readers. The Viking world was not shy, nor was it obsessed with modesty in the way later Christian Europe would become. Sexual activity, especially within marriage, was seen as part of life. A man who fails in bed often fails in life. A woman who complained was not seen as immoral, she was seen as honest. This openness extended into rituals and public events. Wedding feasts often included jokes about fertility and strength. Symbols like Thor's hammer were placed in the bride's lap to bless the marriage. The wedding night itself might involve family members escorting the couple to their bed. In some areas, it was customary for female relatives to undress the bride and inspect the sheets the next morning. Privacy was limited. Expectations were clear, so when a woman spoke out, she wasn't breaking a taboo, she was acting within her rights, and that made her statements all the more powerful. She didn't need to scream or cry, just a few clear words, repeated in the right setting, could devastate a man's future, and everyone around them would nod, because they knew the rules. They knew that in a society where honour was everything, being called inadequate meant losing everything. Of course, not every accusation was fair. Some women may have lied or exaggerated. Others may have used the system to punish men for unrelated grievances. But that's true of any legal right. The fact remains that Viking women had a tool many others didn't, and they weren't afraid to use it. There's something strangely modern about it, isn't there? That someone could lose social status because of what happened under a blanket. For Viking men, this was the other battlefield. One, they couldn't fight with steel. One where silence could be deadly, and the wrong partner could be your undoing. For Viking women, it was an edge, a rare moment where they controlled the story, and the story had consequences. As we continue, we'll look deeper into how these sexual roles shaped legal traditions, and how the idea of masculinity and dominance was written directly into Viking law codes. After seeing how Viking women could use public accusation to destroy a man's honour, it's essential to look at how Viking men themselves were trapped in another cycle. It wasn't just about strength, it was about being seen as dominant at all times, and in the Viking world, dominance often meant aggression. This was not something that stopped in battle. It followed men into their homes, their beds, and even their private reputations. A man who didn't assert himself constantly was at risk, not just of being laughed at, but of being stripped of his social rights. The pressure to perform sexually was not about pleasure or intimacy. It was about power. A man had to be seen as the initiator, the aggressor, the one who took what he wanted. If he showed gentleness, hesitation, or affection that looked too tender, people started talking. He might be called soft, or worse, submissive. And once that word was attached to him, it spread like smoke. Neighbours would whisper. Family members might distance themselves. Rivals would seize the opportunity. This fear of appearing weak led to a loop. To prove strength, many men turned to violence, and not just in public, in private too. Sexual aggression became a tool, something that reinforced their place in the hierarchy. A violent man was a man in control, or so they believed. The rougher the act, the more it proved that he wasn't passive. And if the woman suffered in silence or stayed quiet, the system kept working. It's like when someone yells in a meeting just to sound like they're the boss, even if no one asked their opinion. These performances of dominance didn't happen by accident. They were reinforced by expectations passed down through families, sagas, and traditions. Boys grew up learning that to be respected, They needed to be feared not just on the battlefield, but in their household. If a husband were too kind, his wife might speak out. If he were too soft, others might make assumptions. And so the pressure to dominate became a kind of armour. It protected them from being labelled as weak, but it also trapped them in roles they couldn't escape. Sexual violence, in that context, wasn't always driven by lust. It was often strategic, a way to assert class, gender, or age superiority. A master over a servant, a warrior over a captive, a husband over a wife. These actions maintained the structure. They reminded everyone of their place. And those at the bottom knew they had little power to fight back, because if they did, they would be accused of disrespecting a superior, and that, too, could bring punishment. This might be one of the few societies where failure to intimidate could literally cost you your legal identity. The irony is that this constant demand for masculine control made many Viking men deeply insecure. Their identities were fragile. One insult could bring everything down. One accusation could ruin them. So they doubled down. More aggression, more control, more fear, and the cycle continued. The more they feared being seen as weak, the more forcefully they acted, and each act of violence became both a shield and a message. I am not passive. I am not less. I am still a man. This didn't just affect individuals. It shaped the culture. Communities became places where showing emotional vulnerability could be dangerous, where the worst thing someone could say wasn't that you lied, but that you submitted. Submission, in Viking law and custom, equated to social death. And because sex was tied so closely to social status, even the bedroom became a battleground. It reminds me of how some people today think admitting to therapy is a weakness, when really it's just human. Some men probably resented this system. They might have wanted different relationships, gentler ones, more equal ones, but the risk was too high. To be seen loving too much, caring too deeply, or hesitating even once could draw suspicion. And in a society where being labelled unmanly could result in exile or worse, few were willing to test the limits. Viking laws even protected this cycle. While some accusations could be taken to court, many weren't. If a man were violent toward his wife but claimed she had questioned his manhood, he might be excused. After all, he was only defending his honour, and honour, in the Viking world, was sacred. It was a man's armour. Lose that, and you lose everything. This fear-based structure bred paranoia. Men watched each other constantly. They joked in ways that were half warnings. They tested each other's reactions. And if someone failed to respond with the right amount of force or swagger, it was noted. That man might find himself challenged in public, insulted in private, or avoided altogether. He was no longer safe. I've always found it sad that so many Viking men lived like they were in a constant audition for manhood. In this environment, it's no surprise that violence became normalised, not just on the battlefield, but in homes, in ceremonies, and in sex. Young boys learned early what was expected, and if they didn't learn fast enough, someone made sure they did. The violence wasn't random. It was taught, justified, and even celebrated, because in their minds, it protected them from being degraded. Of course, there were exceptions. There were probably quiet couples who loved each other gently, communities where these extremes were less visible. But the fact that sagas, laws, and oral traditions all echoed the same message tells us that the pattern was real. The threat was real, and the fear of being seen as passive shaped lives more than any sword or axe ever did. This cycle of sexual aggression didn't create strong men, it created scared ones. Men are too afraid to be vulnerable, too afraid to lose their place, too afraid to stop hurting others, because hurting others was how they survived. In the next part, we'll explore how this obsession with dominance carried into public rituals, and how even funerals reflected a deep fear of losing masculine control in death. The Viking obsession with dominance did not stop at defending personal masculinity or controlling women. It extended into the battlefield and political sphere, but not in the way you might expect. While some cultures celebrated victory with banners and trophies, Viking raiders sometimes used the bodies of their defeated enemies as a message, not just with swords or axes, but with acts of sexual symbolism meant to humiliate and destroy a man standing even after death. In Viking ideology, the worst thing that could happen to a man was to lose his masculine power. So what better way to obliterate a rival than to attack exactly that? One of the most brutal and symbolic forms of this was the act of male-on-male domination, not as a result of desire, but purely to shame. In Viking society, it wasn't the act itself that mattered most. It was the role. To be on the receiving end meant to be conquered, dishonoured, stripped of manhood. The implication was clear. You had failed to defend your dignity. You were no longer a real man. Sometimes this was done literally, but in many cases, just the threat or accusation could destroy a man's place in society. It's like if someone could ruin your entire career today just by starting a rumour that you always ask for decaf. This symbolic act of sexual conquest was especially present during public punishments or after major defeats. Some sagas describe enemies being subdued, then violated not for pleasure, but for spectacle. In certain cases, the act didn't even need to happen. A gesture was enough. A thrust of a weapon into the rear. A public jest about what had been done. A drawing carved into wood. These were not random cruelties. They were calculated strikes meant to collapse a man's honour from within. Some raiders even used these tactics when sacking villages, while killing an enemy might remove a threat. Humiliating him destroyed the lineage. If a leader were known to have been dominated, his sons might never rise to power. His brothers might be ashamed to defend him. His followers could abandon his cause. The attack went deeper than the flesh. It rewrote how others saw him, how his story would be told, and whether his bloodline deserved to continue. This shows how, in Viking culture, masculinity was not just an individual trait, it was an inherited currency. The act of anal violation, either real or symbolic, was not viewed as sexual in a conventional way. In fact, it was framed as the opposite. For the Vikings, it had nothing to do with pleasure and everything to do with status. Just like a slave could be stripped of clothing to indicate ownership, a man stripped of sexual dominance was publicly rebranded as inferior. This was sometimes done in war, but also in revenge killings or long-standing blood feuds. It was a tool as powerful as a sword, but far more insidious. There are accounts from medieval chroniclers, especially outsiders who observed Viking behaviour, that describe this with a mix of horror and fascination. Ibn Fadlan, the Arab diplomat who travelled among the Rus, a Viking-descended group, detailed practices and beliefs that place sexual dominance at the centre of public rituals. Even if the acts weren't carried out in his presence, the stories circulated widely. They were known, feared, and accepted as a terrifying part of Viking warfare. The power of this form of humiliation lay in its permanence. A man could recover from a wound. He could even win back a lost battle. But once his name was attached to the image of sexual submission, there was no way back. He became the target of jokes, whispers, and social death. Even if he denied it, people would always remember, and memory was everything. In a culture that passed history through saga and poem, your reputation was your legacy. Sometimes I wonder if the Viking sagas had a gossip column buried somewhere in the verses. The logic behind these acts was disturbingly consistent. In Viking law and custom, a man had the right to kill someone who accused him of being passive. But if that accusation was proven or widely believed, the law often sided with the dominant figure. That meant the one accused could lose not only his rights but his protection. It was a high-stakes game, where words became weapons and gestures cut deeper than blades. There were even ceremonial ways of declaring this kind of dominance. At times, defeated enemies were posed in suggestive ways after death. Their bodies were displayed in positions that mimicked submission. In some cases, effigies or sculptures were left behind to mock them. These acts weren't just cruelty, they were public announcements, a statement that this man had been stripped, shamed, and removed from the ranks of true warriors. For surviving members of a defeated family or clan, this kind of legacy was devastating. It made revenge harder, it damaged alliances, and it forced many to live with the shadow of a relative who had failed in the worst way. Not in battle, but in bed. Or so the story went. Viking masculinity was not about emotion, courage, or wisdom. It was about power. Visible, aggressive, undeniable power. Once that was gone, everything else followed. Compared to that, modern insults about someone's social media profile seem almost friendly. Looking back, it's clear that the Vikings used sexuality as more than a private act. It was a language, a weapon, a public statement, just like plundering a monastery or burning a rival's house. Symbolically violating a man sent a message. It meant, I defeated you so completely that I own your story now. And in the Viking worldview, that was the ultimate form of control. Today, we often think of war as physical and strategy-based. But for the Vikings, psychological warfare played just as large a role. If they could make people fear humiliation more than death, then they had already won before the axe fell. That's why even today, these stories feel disturbing. They reveal a society where sexuality and violence walked hand in hand, and where public shame was more lasting than any scar. What shocks me most is how planned it all was. They didn't stumble into cruelty, they rehearsed it. As we go deeper into these practices, we'll see how these rules didn't just apply to men. Viking women, too, had a place in this brutal hierarchy, and sometimes they learned to use it to their advantage. In the next part, we'll look at how female sexuality became both a shield and a sword in a world ruled by force. In Viking society, losing a battle was not the worst fate a man could suffer, especially for kings and chieftains. Defeat often came with something even more devastating than death. It came with public humiliation. And among the most horrifying forms of that humiliation was sexual violation. Not in private, not hidden in the dark, but in front of an audience, with eyes watching and remembering. Because for Vikings, stripping a man of his masculinity in front of others meant stripping him of his authority forever. This practice wasn't widespread in everyday life, but it loomed large in sagas and oral traditions. Captured kings and rival leaders who dared to challenge the wrong people could find themselves subjected to this ultimate punishment. It was not about lust, it was about making a point, a very public point, that the person you once called a ruler was now no more than a symbol of shame. It's hard to imagine any modern politician surviving such a scandal without needing a new identity and a cave to hide in. In these events, the victim was displayed before the crowd, not to be heard, but to be broken. The people attending were not there to witness justice. They were there to witness the fall of a man's identity, his name, his legacy. In Viking terms, it was the removal of his honour covering, something invisible, but very real in their culture. Once torn away, there was no stitching it back. For the crowd, this was not only a moment of entertainment, it was also a warning, a message that echoed through generations. The man who once led armies could not even protect himself. Worse, he could not protect his body from being made into a message, and in a society where physical power was everything, that was the end. Even if he lived afterward, he would be a ghost among the living. What made this worse was that the act was not only physical but symbolic. Being raped, in Viking eyes, wasn't just an act of violence. It meant you were no longer a man. You had crossed into the category of the used, of the submissive, and in their hierarchy, there was no place lower. From that moment on, your voice carried no weight. Your sword meant nothing. Even your kin might refuse to avenge you, because doing so could stain their own names. It's a bit like how, today, losing control of your online image can destroy your career, relationships, and even your place in society. The sagas tell of chieftains who were paraded, tied, and symbolically unmanned in front of former allies and enemies. Some of them died during the act. Others chose death afterward, because in their worldview, it was not just pain they experienced, it was the death of the self, the death of all that they had fought to build. And perhaps the worst part was knowing that the stories would outlive them. In one tale, a leader from a rival clan was captured during a failed raid. Instead of a swift execution, his captors chose a slower path. They bound him, insulted him, and then performed the act that would erase his name from the list of real men. The crowd did not cheer, it stayed quiet, not from respect, but from the weight of what they were witnessing. A line had been crossed, and yet it was a line their culture allowed. The legal codes in parts of Viking society did not protect men from this. On the contrary, if the person performing the act was in a dominant position, and if the community agreed that the victim had brought dishonour, the act could be justified. There were no clear trials for this, no witnesses called. It was judgment by humiliation, a form of justice that carried no appeal. Honestly, even Viking HR departments